Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Breakfast special.
Welcome to the Breakfast Special. All over the world, there's been growing concern over bird flu in recent weeks. Louisiana reported the first U.S. fatality from avian influenza, and closer to home, Cambodia confirmed its first death caused by the bird flu in the new year. Also known as H5N1, it's a disease caused by a virus that infects birds and sometimes other animals like foxes, seals, and otters. And almost all cases of infection in people have been associated with close contact to infected dead or live birds or contaminated environments. With bird flu cases on the rise, will it become the next global pandemic? For more insights, we're joined by Professor Gavin Smith, Director of the Program in Emerging Infectious Diseases at Duke-NUS Medical School. Good morning, Gavin. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Good morning, Audrey.
It's great to have you walk through this with us, Gavin. So scientists are increasingly concerned about the potential for bird flu to cause a pandemic. So based on what we know so far, with all of the uncertainty around the virus, what should we be doing now to prepare? And have we learned any lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic that can probably guide us?
Yeah, so overall, we're much better prepared for an influenza pandemic than we are for other pathogens. And the reason for that is that we have existing influenza vaccines that can be updated for new strains that might emerge. And then on top of that, H5 viruses have been studied for over 25 years. The first cases, human cases, emerged in Hong Kong back in 1997. And we've actually been testing H5N1 vaccines for many years. So it should be possible to produce a vaccine in a short amount of time. And on top of that, we also have drugs, medicines that are used to treat influenza infection that have been used for human influenza and are effective in H5N1 cases also. So really the difference with COVID was that we have the vaccines and medicines available, but we did not with COVID, and everything had to be generated from scratch effectively. And then in terms of lessons that we've learnt from the COVID pandemic, I think at least in Singapore, the COVID pandemic taught us the information that we need to find out to control the virus. And in response to COVID, there was an infrastructure built for responding to pandemics. And so I think our response would overall be much quicker and more targeted and coordinated, and hopefully that would help us control the influenza pandemic much more effectively.
Yeah, so learning from experience there. And historically, we know from experience as well that viruses often need just a few genetic changes to become more transmissible. So what's your assessment of the current transmissibility of bird flu among humans, especially with the latest genetic variant? And how big of a concern is this?
So it's always a concern. And as I said, H5 has been circulating for many years. So it's a very heavily studied virus, and we have a good sense of what mutations are required to help it transmit in animal models, experimental models, but we really don't know what is required in humans. There's been human infections occurring since the early 2000s, and the viruses at the moment are still not, there's little or no human-to-human transmission of these viruses. And what we're still seeing, as you mentioned in the intro, is animal-to-human transmission, including in the United States. If you look at the amount of exposure to the virus, particularly in Asia and live bird markets, the number of people that are infected, it's actually a very rare occurrence. So it's hard to assess, but at the moment, there's little or no human-to-human transmission.
Okay. Are there any factors, bringing it back here to Singapore, what factors in Singapore could maybe exacerbate transmission risks?
Yeah, so the biggest risk for transmission to humans is contact with infected poultry. And typically in Asia, this occurs in live bird markets that are common. But Singapore, we don't have these markets, and so that risk of transmission to humans is very low. But if the virus is able to transmit from human to human, there would be similar risks that we see for human influenza. So exposure to an infected person, coughing or sneezing, and the typical sort of protections such as avoiding those situations or wearing masks, hand washing, etc., would be an effective way to prevent infection.
Okay. And we understand that Singapore is working on a transmission model to kind of predict the spread of bird flu. Could you explain how such a model would work and any potential benefits or downsides you can share?
Yeah, so if you know how the virus is likely to spread, you can plan interventions to slow down that spread before vaccines and treatments become available. But it's important for those transmission models to have good information, because the model that you generate is only as good as the data that you use in the model. So we have to have accurate information that we can use in modelling transmission. So as I mentioned earlier, we learned from the pandemic what information we would need so that we could produce an accurate transmission model. It's just a matter of gathering that information.
All right. Well, Gavin, you did touch on vaccines a little earlier, and some countries are already stockpiling these vaccines. You know, this includes the U.S. that should be at least somewhat effective against H5N1. To what extent can these vaccines save us against the variants currently circulating and in the event of a global outbreak?
Yeah, so stockpile vaccines can be very effective, but it can also be quite expensive, particularly if the vaccines used and expire and maybe have to be disposed of. I think we've been testing H5N1 vaccines for many, many years. And so what we do have is vaccine seed stock that can be provided to vaccine manufacturers very quickly so that they can grow up the virus for the vaccine and shorten the time to production. I think the other thing to consider is the influenza vaccines have two components. They have an H5 component and an N1 component, the neuraminidase. And that N1 component is related to the N1 that's in current human influenza vaccines, H5N1 virus. So it's not exactly clear, but there's a chance that there might be some protection from that neuraminidase component of the virus in the vaccine.
Okay. And we also know that many migratory birds pass through Singapore each year. Is this something that we should be concerned about, you think?
Not particularly. In general, people here have very little contact with wild birds, and particularly the migratory bird species. And also the birds that do migrate through Singapore are monitored for influenza and are free from H5N1 virus. And then on top of that, the species that we do have here are not particularly known to be susceptible to H5N1. It's not like just any bird can get infected with H5N1 virus. There are some species that are not particularly susceptible. So I think the chances of transmission from migratory birds is very low.
Okay. And so finally, Gavin, what precautions should the public take? You know, is it possible to prevent bird flu infections entirely?
Yeah, I think just generally not having exposure to infected animals, whether they be dead or alive. And of course, you're not going to know that in advance. So, just stay away from wild birds in particular. I just really want to emphasise that the chances of infection are quite low. The virus has been circulating in neighbouring countries for many, many years. And, there's still very low numbers of infection. And this is despite there being a lot of infection in the poultry. So cook the chicken meat properly, proper hygiene, and don't play around with wild birds.
All right. Well, yeah, it seems like just be aware of the risks, but also don't panic. Bird flu remains a concern globally, but with preparedness and the right measures, its risks can certainly be mitigated. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for shedding light on this important topic for us.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking with Professor Gavin Smith, Director of the Program in Emerging Infectious Diseases at Duke-NUS Medical School. Stay ahead with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.